This is fantastic. A very warm welcome to all of you, and very particularly to Dame Stephanie in our wonderful Jacqueline Dupre Music Centre. I'm absolutely thrilled as a very new girl at this college to meet Dame Stephanie and to be aware that her sister was an alumna here from 1948 to 1951. Not only was she an alumna, she was an exhibitioner in English. So it's a very great privilege to be able to open the proceedings here tonight. And for such an amazing person. Dame Stephanie is a visionary. She is an enormously, how shall we say, someone who saw the future before everybody else. Who would have imagined combining, taking women who probably would not have been able to join the workforce and bringing them together to do amazing things with electrical engineering, electronics, and instrumentation. Indeed, I might be so bold to say that Dame Stephanie was ready for the pandemic 60 years ago. And there are some of us who would feel that actually she should have been running the country as well. She is courageous and committed. Can you imagine as a young girl getting onto the Kindertransport and traveling for 3 days, landing in a completely new country, and then building a life out of that? And she became an extremely creative entrepreneur and an extremely generous philanthropist. Reading a little bit about it only gives a tiny glimpse into the combination of inspiration, incredible goals that she must have had in her life, and the enormous hard work that was necessary to make it all happen. We probably won't hear about the hard work. We'll hear about some of the other things. But one thing that really interests me is the persistence that must have been required to make it in what was undoubtedly a man's world in those days. And I think of St. Hilda's motto, non frustra vixi, which is rather past folk, as I didn't live in vain. And all I can say is non frustra vivimus, that Dame Stephanie is still living the life and doing amazing things. And on that note, I'm delighted to invite a very special person, Dame Stephanie Shirley CH, which, by the way, for the younger people here is just a very exclusive club of 65 people, Companion of Honor. A very special person, Dame Stephanie Shirley, to hold the principal special lecture in 2022. Dame Stephanie.
I think we're going to have a bit of music to start with.
To England, for the children, there are trains. Trains, there are trains. Trains, there are trains. To England, for the children, there are trains. Going fast over the waves, transform the road, their strength is strong and strong, like swirls of snow, they eddy round and slip like secrets underground. Trains, there are trains.
The music you've been hearing comes from Carl Davis's opera play, his musical work called Last Train to Tomorrow. It was sung by the children of a Czechoslovakian choir. It was composed 10 years ago as really to commemorate the Kindertransport, that remarkable, largely spontaneous, very much improvised, rescue effort which brought thousands of Jewish children out of Nazi Europe to England and other places in 1938 and 39, the very brink of war. Now, I was one of them, and tonight I want to tell you the story of my family. Of course, hundreds and thousands of children never had the chance to make it to safety. They were left behind, and later with their parents and grandparents, faced deportation and near certain death. The Nazis created a regime of systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder, worse than any that the world has seen. It killed 2 out of every 3 European Jews, and hundreds and thousands of Roma and Sinti people also. The Nazis called it the final solution. We call it the Holocaust, or the Shoah, which is Hebrew for catastrophe. The candle marks Britain's promise to remember the Holocaust, to remember the millions who suffered. Candles play a part in many different cultures because their effect is soothing, I hope you will find, and they act as symbols of light in the darkness of life. There is a purpose in these ceremonies, in the act of remembering. The Holocaust was the worst genocide in history. And one of its lessons is that genocides don't just happen. They only occur when people stand by, afraid to speak out, or worse, are indifferent. And by remembering the Holocaust, we keep the knowledge of it and the lessons that it can teach us alive in our minds and in our discourse. I'm not an academic, but believe my talk will be valuable to social historians. Our world today is full of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, fleeing war, unrest, poverty, and the effects of climate change. Tonight offers a chance not just to remember those who died in the Nazi genocide, but also to think about all those suffering today, the fear and anxiety that goes along with displacement, with being forced to abandon one's home, and, if you're lucky, find another. A refugee asked recently what home meant to them. Replied, home is where, when you go there, they have to let you in. What a sad remark. I was once a refugee, and will speak today about my family's experiences as refugees. And our stories may serve as a commentary on love and hate. The number of the dead is not the sole tragedy of the Jewish people. I shall tell the personal stories of my secular Jewish father, Gentile mother, and my sister and I, offensively called crossbreeds, who all came to Britain as exiles in 1939 and survived. As you've heard, my sister Renate studied here as an exhibitioner back in 1948, when it was a women's college, of course. St. Hilda's has a reputation for excellence in English, and that is what she read. And I always envied her years here and the lifelong friends that she made. But she had to live cheaply so as to be able to pay the family mortgage out of her exhibitioner's monies. Amazing. Later, she gained a postgraduate diploma in childcare at Exeter, earning her keep by working as a cook, live-in cook. And we were close throughout our lives. She was always my big sister, who was all I had to clutch on to when we both escaped from Nazi Europe. She aged 9, I was 5. Later on, she worked for the Devon Social Services and for many years. Now, I'm one of the few people still alive to bear witness to that dreadful time. And you, therefore, are the very last generation to hear these stories firsthand. As the so-called Third Reich slips from human memory, I join in Britain's promise to remember. We started off a respectable German family in Dortmund, which lies bang in the center of Europe. The four of us lived in a nice house in a fashionable part of the city. Renate went to school with the children of other prosperous bourgeois families. We never know what life holds for us. If all had gone according to plan, we would have remained in that comfortable, over-comfortable perhaps, world indefinitely. But the shadows had been gathering since shortly after my birth in 1933, and I was not a good time to be Jewish. That's a significant Freudian slip. I do apologize for it. But it's not the first time that I've talked about my birth in 1939. My father, Renate Buchthal, was a young judge, a brilliant but rather distant man with a rather single-minded devotion to principle that was slightly unworldly. I have a vivid early memory of going for a family walk in one of Dortmund's beautiful parks. It was well known for its parks. And stamping, for some reason, on a beetle. I was 4 years old. My father erupted in a blazing fury. How would you like it if somebody, great big foot, came down and stamped on you, he said. It was an amazing tirade to give to a 4-year-old. Yet he did get his point through to me, and my moral compass certainly stems from him. In 1933, he was fired by edict of the Third Reich because of his Jewish ethnicity. And again we were forced to move from city to city and then from country to country in search of work and security. We eventually settled in Vienna, my mother's home city. By my 5th birthday, a few weeks before Kristallnacht, when Nazis unleashed a series of pogroms against the Jewish population, the writing was on the wall for anyone who cared to read it. Jewish families who stayed in Central Europe faced catastrophe. And it was my father who first faced up to the fact that we had no choice. The only choice was between escape and annihilation. One of my clearest recollections of that time is of walking with my mother to collect my sister from school. I particularly remember part of the route going along a very high stone wall. And I discovered 2 things about that memory when I returned to Vienna, to Dortmund after the war. First, the wall wasn't high at all. It was I who'd been small. And Secondly, I learned why we always meticulously went to collect her from school, because Renate was suffering from anti-Semitism in the school. She had a kind teacher who used to let her out early so that she could get away from her fellow pupils with their shouts of dirty Jew and throwing stones at her. By 1939, all the borders were gradually closing. And when my parents heard about the Kindertransport, they made the desperate decision that my sister and I should be sent to England into the arms of strangers in order to save our lives. The Kindertransport organized its trains from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the free city of Danzig. Each train had about 1,000 children aged 5 to 16. Some small 17-year-old people also snuck in, with just 2 adults in the whole train. There were also some girls, 16 plus, so not eligible to escape, caring for babies. Of course, I didn't know at the time that they had volunteered to travel under a concession dependent on their return to what they must have known was almost certain death. Courage takes many forms, and I always honor the sheer heroism of those young people. And recently learned of one of them. This is Lily Reichenfeldt, who made 2 such loving journeys of love and honored the guarantee given by her non-Jewish friend, and to Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and oblivion followed. Let me thank the Christian and Jewish activists who set up the Kindertransport, the Quaker Society of Friends who gave it money when it was just about to go bankrupt, and the many volunteers who administered that largest ever recorded migration of children. But it was not a simple matter. Forms had to be filled in, documents stamped, permits queued for at seemingly deliberately inconvenient times, guarantees obtained. And Renate and I spent several weeks in a children's home so that my mother could devote herself full time to grappling with the both Nazi and, she said, British bureaucracy. And as time ran out, people started to forge Home Office entry permits. There was no limit to the permitted number of children to be rescued. Nothing was ever publicly announced, but Britain capped its number at 10,000. Compare that with the number of refugees Britain talks about admitting today. While some children had to go into hostels, the refugee children's movement had found Renate and me some foster parents in England who were prepared to prepay our future repatriation costs. They put up about 5,000 in today's money, and to guarantee that the 2 of us would not be a burden on the state. Thank you, Guy and Ruby Smith. We call them Uncle and Auntie. They nurtured us as they would their own, and certainly I am their child in all but birth. Everyone told me to be grateful. Indeed, I am grateful, but also loved them dearly, cared for them in their old age, and honor their memories, as I do all the uncles and aunties who saw us children through those terrible times. the fact that people I did not know saved us by doing what selfless, generous people do made a deep impression. We progressed from being termed enemy aliens to, once somebody realized we were children, friendly enemy aliens. And post-war, that it changed again to being friendly aliens. And that shifting identity captures hate and happiness, villains and good guys, the fifth columnist or suspected terrorist, the refugee, the unwanted migrant, the asylum seeker, all present a useful outlet for people's fears. Renate and I left Vienna 8 weeks before war was declared. We were doubly lucky in that, unlike many of the children on the Kindertransport, who our parents survived. They separately escaped and survived, though sadly I never bonded with them again. Moving now to Greta, our Austrian mother. She was the younger daughter of an established Gentile family who'd educated her to be a middle-class wife. And although my father wrote in 1940 that he feared my mother was lost, a euphemism used in front of children, she did manage her own desperate escape across Europe to England by train, bribing her way across Europe, at one time, as she frequently told us afterwards, with the fur coat that she was wearing in order to get onto a train. And what happened to her when she finally got to England, penniless and homeless, 4 days before war was declared? The regulations were such that she was only allowed to work either in agriculture or domestic service, and she chose the latter and cleaned somebody else's nice house for the duration of the war. Later on, she moved to be a live-in cook at a hostel for 40 schoolgirls, and later still she finished up as a teacher of geography, notably not German. One summer, she and I went to Vienna together, partly in her search for family and friends, partly to dig up the silver which had been buried for safety. We made a grim train journey across Europe, weighed down with emotional baggage and expectation, before finally emerging in the glorious, historic city from which we'd escaped 20 years earlier. I looked around at its gracious avenues, ancient walls, grand palaces, and elegant squares. And while previously I'd wept sentimentally on hearing Viennese music, now I realized in an instant that the city meant absolutely nothing to me, and felt the weight of my past lighten. Was my mother happy? I remember her inconsolable tears when one of the few things from the past got broken, and her will asked us to scatter her ashes in the Vienna woods, which says a lot about how she felt about her long exile. My main memory of that filial visit was of Renate's preoccupation with evaluating the likely role of people that we saw in the streets who would have been adults in the 1930s. What were you doing when they were throwing stones at me? Going back to my father, the Jewish one of the family, so necessarily the first to escape, having walked over the mountains from Vienna to neutral Switzerland, and thence more conventionally to England, he finished the war wearing a British Army uniform, which he'd acquired after somewhat around-the-world travels. Apparently, there had been widespread failure to differentiate between the genuine refugees from the Nazis. And as an adult male German refugee, my father was deported in July 1940 to Australia. He went from Liverpool on the transport ship Dunera. They were guarded by soldiers on light duty, having been shell-shocked at Dunkirk. In any event, they ran amok, locked the internees below deck for most of the 58-day journey, stole their valuables, and threw their suitcases overseas. And the conditions on that grossly overcrowded journey were so appalling that, to Britain's everlasting credit, Parliament found time in the midst of the war to debate the scandal. And those deportees who survived the journey, 2 died and 50 went straight to hospital, then travelled to an internment camp in New South Wales, near Sydney, so in the middle of an inhospitable nowhere that the high security fence was almost unnecessary. And the largely professional inmates made the best of their plight, printing their own money, creating their own system of law and order, and developing an unofficial university with remarkable educational and cultural programs, concerts, and much else. By May 1941, partly as a result of the outcry in Britain, as families heard, despite all mail being censored, about the iniquity of their treatment, my father was released to join the Pioneer Corps, and so found himself again back in the UK. And the Pioneer Corps was a relatively new auxiliary force, dubbed the King's most loyal enemy aliens, which provided backup services for the conventional armed forces. And he started off digging ditches and such like. He was later transferred to head the what became the Mid-Wales psychiatric hospital, which was used to treat mentally ill prisoners of war. He used a pseudonym so that the German prisoners would not know his original nationality. And some VIP visitors were rather surprised to find a lowly staff sergeant running such a large establishment, but apparently that was the highest rank available to a non-Brit. After the war, my parents were free, in theory, to return to the homeland from which they'd driven 6 years earlier. My father was desperate to rebuild his legal career in Germany. To move anywhere else would mean giving up the sheer career dreams that defined him. My mother saw it differently. She had had a world in Germany, a comfort, status, and material security. And bit by bit, it had been stolen from her. Perhaps some of her very identity had been stolen. And having escaped with her life and very little else, it was unthinkable to her that her husband should do anything but build a new life in England from scratch, just as she had done. And the outcome was to modernize, predictable. They divorced, and my father returned to Germany almost immediately. Shortly before the end of the war, my father had left the British Army and transferred into the American Army, which was looking for educated German speakers to run what remained of the country. He worked at the Nuremberg Trials, in particular researching the role of Adolf Eichmann. And that was how my sister and I came to attend the Nuremberg Trials, because we were visiting him one summer. Those visits were very memorable, because Germany had entirely broken down. The contrast to the orderly society of Britain could not have been stronger or more nightmarish. There was no money, no gas, electricity, clean water. The only semblance of civil society was the crude military authority of the occupying Allies. And people were living in the cellars of ruined buildings, bartering sex for food to survive, using cigarettes as currency. Black marketeer, white slaver, there was no warmth in anybody's face. They were all just blank, really, from hunger and fear. And we'd lived through 6 years of the most devastating war in human history. But this was our first glimpse of the utter dehumanizing horror and destruction of war. Let me refocus on the shared Kindertransport experience of we two sisters, me at age 5, clutching the hand of my 9-year-old sister. So what was that 2.5-day journey like? It's hard, after all the years, to be certain how many of the remembered details are real and how much I've added to my memories from other sources. Was the July weather outside really grey? Or have I just seen too many black and white pictures of the Kindertransport? I've read that some of the trains were sealed. But surely one boy in our compartment kept getting off to be sick every time the train made one of its unscheduled stops. Or was that just a dream? I'm pretty sure that I know that we slept on long strips of corrugated cardboard on the floor, as well as on the benches, and believe it or not, in the overhead luggage racks. Though the scene in my mind's eye is different from the archive pictures that I have seen since, I must have slept as well, but I can't remember sleeping. I think my mother had given us sandwiches for the 2.5-day journey, but again, I may be wrong. I do remember the occasional frightening interruptions by uniformed guards, nasty they were, and recall vividly the oily, cold smell of the sea when we finally reached the channel at the Hook van Holland. I vaguely remember the nauseous night crossing to Harwich. But what about my sense that when we finally arrived by train at London's Liverpool Street Station, the platform was silent? Silent. It seems somehow implausible. And perhaps I've merely projected the numbness of my emotions onto the past. Nonetheless, that is how my mind has preserved it. hundreds of tired, unwashed children spilling out onto the platform, speechless and wide-eyed. We had numbered labels hanging round our necks, as if we were lost property. In a sense, we were. Renate also had an expensive Leica slung around her person, because one was, oddly enough, permitted to bring out a camera, but not to bring out any money. We waited to be claimed, sitting on straw-filled mattresses at the back of a cavernous hall. We had survived. To a certain extent, we refugees were like the evacuees. Starting August 1939, the 3.5 million people, mainly children, evacuated into safety from areas of danger. My image of Britain is of a quiet country where even outsiders like me could be confident that those in authority would generally do their best for us, do the right thing by us. We had some useful phrases that my impractical father had taught us. So I could say, slow combustion stove, and vine screen Viper, but not, forgive me, Principal, to know how to ask to go to the bathroom. Of course, pain allows you to grow, but many exiles suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or both. I had problems of identity, which took 6 years of analysis at the renowned Tavistock Clinic to overcome. And some exiles' psychological scars were so deep as to be transmitted to their children. I became a pioneer of computing and a pathfinder in the professionalism of women, an entrepreneur in the early 1960s, sharing ownership with the staff. And when the company was acquired after 45 years, it was a public company in the FTSE 250, employing over 8,000 people, and I became a strategic giver away of my wealth. Renate never settled as well as I did, and remained an exile in spirit. She declined several Home Office invitations to apply for British citizenship, until its final letter suggested that if she did not want to become British, having been to school here and all, perhaps she should go back to where she came from. And that she certainly did not want to do. So she upped sticks and emigrated to Australia on £10 assisted passage. And she applied for Australian citizenship after only 6 months. And I've often thought about that. We didn't choose to come to Britain. The exile was done to us children. And as now an adult, Renate had ceased to be a victim and could make things happen rather than have things happen to her. She chose Australia, and having re-qualified there, contributed significantly to its childcare practices, which was her skill, sublimating the trauma of her own childhood by helping children, including many of the Vietnamese boat children, into adoptive and foster families. She married an Australian, and they adopted a baby girl and fostered 2 brothers, just as we 2 sisters had been fostered a generation back. Renate and I had tried hard to fit into Britain. So many things were different. The plumbing, how cold the winter was without central heating. Not duvets, but eiderdowns. And they were not, dear children, to be put out on the windows to air. The Brits put milk in their tea. They eat fish paste sandwiches and other strange foods. They use saucepans rather than cooking pots. They even write their sevens differently, even knit differently. Renate kept to the German way. I knit like a true-born Englishwoman. And appearance was another disparity, not racial, but clothes, which Hitler had allowed us to bring out. Mine came in 4 sizes, for me and for me to grow into, and then for Renate, and for Renate to grow into. So even though we were not always living together, there were still 4 very Germanic winter coats of green tweed with grey fur collars that I had to grow my way through. And then there was language. Some exiles became bilingual, yes. Yes, they spoke English, but reverted to German when amongst other emigres. Renate retained her German, though later, when I complimented her, she pointed out that her fluency was with the vocabulary of a 9-year-old. Others retained merely their German accents or intonation, or continued to confuse thank you with no thank you, or word order. Mine is apparently sometimes incorrect, according to a linguist colleague. I was among those who deliberately forgot my German, having actively refused to understand even the simplest question posed in German to my would-be British self. And most of us who arrived aged less than 10 speak only English with a variety of accents, Glaswegian, Welsh, Yorkshire, as well as received pronunciation. I mentioned that post-war, Renate and I sat in on a few sessions of the Nuremberg Trials. Most of the proceedings of that went over my 14-year-old head, but I could understand what was at stake. Renate was better able to appreciate the horror. Indeed, she felt her discussion on the Nuremberg Trials at her college interview resulted in her being awarded an exhibition here. Germany made impressive efforts to come to terms with its Nazi past, and since 1951 has made reparation payments totaling $90 billion. The United Restitution Organization had lawyers dealing with reparation, compensation for stolen property, so much for a lost father, so much for a lost mother, and so on. In our cases, what we'd really lost was educational opportunities. And I started off going through this process, and it was pretty complicated, and I needed a birth certificate, and my birth certificate had been lost, and it was all very complicated. And eventually, I realized, actually, I didn't want Germany's money, and so I stopped the claim proceedings. Renate, being older and wiser, had never started them. But just recently, each of the estimated 1,000 Kindertransportees still living have received windfalls from the German government, totaling over £4,000, partly as moral and material indemnity, and then to help see us through the pandemic. And this time I have learnt to see such gestures of making amends as restorative, and accepted, I hope gracefully, and being no longer in need, I forwarded my bonanza sums to the Safe Passage charity, which supports today's child refugees. The story of the Holocaust is a dreadful one, terrible. But where there are shadows, there must be light. We should also remember the beautiful stories of that time, not only the Kindertransport, but also other escapes, such as the 600 children saved by Sir Nicholas Winton from Czechoslovakia, and the 300 children who'd somehow survived in concentration camps, who were brought to England in 1945, the so-called Windermere children, to be later integrated into British society. And the 180 ultra-Orthodox Kindertransportees who found safe haven in a castle in Wales and trained in agriculture to prepare for life on a religious kibbutz in Israel. I honor all victims of Nazi persecution and of the genocides in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Cambodia, Darfur. The list goes on. Let our words and deeds be of love for our neighbors, respecting and cherishing our differences. Thank you very much.
Dame Stephanie, it is an enormous honour for us at St Hilda's to welcome you back. I know you came as a teenager to visit Renate when she was a student here, and to hear your witness. As you said, it's extremely important for us all to be the witness of witnesses, and my life has been punctuated with encounters with people who escaped Nazi Germany, especially as I'm a student of German. And I hope that everyone here will carry the memory of this occasion with them, especially the young, and remember the passing on of the baton that you've challenged us to, that we must also make sure that our country pays attention to the needs of refugees today.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dame Stephanie has agreed to take questions from the audience for, we say, about 10 minutes, if people have questions. If anyone wishes to, I think we have some roving microphones as well, if people were to want to ask. Do you think I could just kick us off? I've seen one there. But if I could just kick us off, I was very fascinated at the detail of your attending the Nuremberg Trials. And I understand now that happened, that the two of you were taken by your father. I just can't imagine what it must be to have been somebody who was driven out of a country and then within a few years go back and see the regime that had driven you away on trial.
Well, by that time, I was more English than the English, and I was definitely playing the little English girl. My sister was more ambivalent for reasons that I've tried to explain. It was a small courtroom. There were 12 people on trial, all coming out of the legal system. So it was they were lawyers. They all looked very respectable. Some of them looked very kindly. And what I learnt from it, because the technical details went over my head, I was 14 years old. But what I got from that experience was this feeling that those kindly looking faces in the dock, and at the same time I was hearing the terrible, terrible things that they had been doing, and learned once and for all that important lesson, as you can't tell what people are like by looking at them. And I came away with that sort of thinking, I will never, you sort of, oh, he looks nice. Well, he may look nice, but he may be a monster. And that's what I got out of that.
I think we have a question here. Second row.
Thank you. Are you aware of how your father felt going back to Germany and the feelings that he had?
I think he felt that Germany was his country. That was his culture. He'd been educated there. He'd lived there for many years. I think he was glad to get back. He remarried a German girl. So I have a half-sister, or had, she's died now. I think it was just an adult going back, as many people did go for a variety of reasons. They returned, whereas I and many others swore, solemn swear, that we would never set foot on German soil, and then found that we really had to if we were going to keep any family life together.
He never thought of emigrating to Israel or something?
No.
Lady Bullard.
I enjoyed, most interesting, your talk, although I did find it very disappointing because I thought you were going to be your sister, as I'm I was 1 year,
St Hilda's
1 year
1947.
older than her. In the year at St Hilda's, we overlapped. And so anyhow, but this is a very minor question, but you went off to your silver, looking for your silver. I lived, my husband was a diplomat, and we 3 times we were posted in Germany, and once he was there as occupying, doing his military service. And often I met Germans at the end, when the wall came down, who rushed off to the other side, went to their old houses and went to see where they buried the silver. But none of them ever found it.
I think too many neighbours had seen the burial ceremony.
It was nature.
Nature had taken over.
They couldn't recognise the tree that they knew they would recognise.
Oddly enough, when I went back, there was, I could hardly recognise the house at all, but I could recognise the garden. The nature somehow had stayed relatively the same. That garden was still the garden I played in as a kid.
Yeah, Professor McIntosh, the third row.
Thank you so much, Dame Stephanie. I found that deeply moving, as I'm sure many people did, and also hugely inspirational. My question is, was it easy as a young person to talk about your experience, or was it much later in life that you were able to both articulate your experience, and also, I think very importantly, how easy was it to share your experience with other people in Britain?
I never, as a child or young person, spoke about it at all. Obviously, if you're filling in a form or something like that, it comes out. We changed our name on naturalization from an unpronounceable Buchthal, which my sister had. So I became Stephanie Brooke, in honour of the poet Rupert Brooke, but without the E, because I thought that was pretentious, you know. There are big discussions going on in that. In no way did I want to talk about it. As a child, a lot of well-meaning neighbours, my auntie and uncle were absolutely super, but they had well-meaning neighbours, and they would say things to us frequently. Aren't you lucky to be saved? Aren't you lucky to be saved? And that's not a healthy thing to be saying to a 6-year-old. It sort of left me with the sort of survivor guilt, and I only really came out of that when I was able to talk at the Tavistock Clinic about my early start, and it all came out and how I felt about it and so on. Since then, I've been not ambivalent, but I've been perfectly neutral. It just hasn't been important anymore. Until as I got older, I realized that there were so few people who could tell firsthand a story, and I felt I needed to take opportunities to speak about those times, because, as I said, you're the last generation, really, to hear these stories firsthand.
Jan Archer at the back.
Thank you very much. It was, yes, deeply moving. I was wondering if your biological parents and your auntie and uncle, your foster parents, if they met and how often, and how did they react to each other?
Well, they did meet infrequently because people didn't have cars or telephones, and my mother, we knew she was alive, but we didn't really know where she was. Both tried to make it work and succeeded, I think. It did work. The relationship with my birth parents was not good for me, but it was certainly unaffected by my sister. Renate never felt the same, I think, about auntie and uncle. So it was a mixed story, but I mean, so many families are now extended, mixed, cross-nationality, cross-racial. I don't think it would be quite so odd today for... I mean, when I married an Englishman, my to-be in-laws didn't attend the wedding because he was marrying a German. I'd been English for God knows how long by then. They're very deep things for some people, and I tried to find out why they should feel so very strongly. And they were talking about things that had happened in World War I, in the Great War, and it wasn't anything to do with the Holocaust. So these are long-standing things to make reparation, to get people working together, to get people trusting each other. It takes a long, long time because that trust has been broken very, very badly.
It's probably, I think, something that has been underrated. There's a very remarkable novel by a German novelist called Ursula Krechel, called Landgericht, or Country on Trial, perhaps, or District Court, which reconstructs the story of, in fact, it's based on documentary evidence. And it's a very, very shocking read because of the failure of the relationship between the parents when they find their children who've been sent away on Kindertransport.
I mean, there were things that went wrong. Some of the boys, all the young men had gone off to war, so that the boys, and they were up to the age of 16, I mean, those boys were used to work in the fields and worked pretty hard, to be honest. One was just glad to have them there. Some of the girls were sexually abused in their foster parents. You know, if you have a nubile 16-year-old coming into your small domestic house, things can very easily go wrong. I certainly knew of one, Sylvia Schwartz, who was in the same village as I, and it seemed all right at the time, but as soon as she was 18, she left and she was never ever contacted her foster parents again. So something had really gone badly wrong there, and I can only guess what it was.
I think we're going to give the last question before we finish to the principal.
They didn't warn you.
I don't need one of these, but I must.
It's for the recording.
Yes, I must. That was
No longer.
No longer. So I'm very interested in how you made the jump to becoming what today would be called the employer of the last 60 years, probably, and how the humanity and the experiences you had as a young girl led you to the decisions you took as a relatively young entrepreneur. Would you share that with us, please?
The Kindertransport experience did three things for me, really. Because it was such an enormous change for a 6-year-old to go to a new country, new family, new food, new language, new everything, I realized afterwards that I had dealt with that. No other change could throw me as much as that. And that made me actually welcome change. I liked doing new things, making new things happen. And that's pretty useful in the digital world today. Secondly, as I've talked to some of these neighbors who was sort of so unthinking as to keep telling me I was lucky you haven't gone up in soaps, just awful. But then it made me determined to lead a life that was worth saving. And that still drives my life today. I try not to fritter my life away. I try to make each day worth living. I try to enjoy life. I lead a very good life. But most people wouldn't want to work as I do. I still work pretty well full time.
Thank you very much. You have not lived in vain. It's been a great honour, and thank you very much for answering our questions. And as you can hear by that particular quietness in the room, we've heard your message and have taken it very seriously.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
And we do hope
How lovely.
that you will accept.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Now, Dame Stephanie has books for sale outside. I think each sale gives a charitable donation.
It's all for charity.
And she will be just outside this door at a table ready to sign books if you wish to have them signed. But we proceed outside for a drink, for book signing, and for conversation. Thank you.
They smell delicious.